According to the Ukrainian authorities, all safety systems at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant remained fully functional as of yesterday, following the site's loss of connection to a third external power line linking to the national electricity grid. Although officials from Russia's state nuclear power company were present at the facilities in southern Ukraine, Ukrainian staff continue to operate the plant. The Chernobyl power plant remains connected to the national electricity grid following reconnection on 4th of March. However, Ukrainian operators and guards have not been able to rotate for 3 weeks now. The IAEA has reported that, according to the Ukrainian authorities, 8 of the country's 15 reactors remained operating. I understand that regarding nuclear safeguards, the IAEA is still not receiving remote data transmission from its monitoring systems installed at Chernobyl, but such data was being transferred to IAEA headquarters from the other nuclear power plants in Ukraine. I take this opportunity to reiterate the Secretary General's support for efforts by the IAEA to establish a framework on the safety and security of Ukraine's nuclear facilities and urge all parties to work towards this end. Mr. President, I wish to also highlight the terrible toll this conflict is having on civilians. The civilian casualties continue to rise. As of 16 March, the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights had recorded 2,032 civilian casualties, including 780 killed, of whom 58 were children. The actual number of casualties is believed to be much higher. Most of these casualties are caused by the use of explosive weapons with a wide area impact. These include attacks using heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems, ballistic and cruise missiles, and airstrikes. I also want to reiterate that attacks directed at civilians are prohibited by international humanitarian law. We must find a diplomatic solution to this war to put an end to the violence. As Secretary General Guterres said, and I quote, "We need an immediate cessation of hostilities and serious negotiations based on the principles of the UN Charter and international law. We need peace, peace for the people of Ukraine, peace for the world. We need peace now." I thank you very much for your attention.
أشكر السيدة ناكاميتسو على إحاطتها. أعطي الكلمة الآن لأعضاء
I thank Ms. Nakamitsu for her presentation and now give the floor to members of the Council who wish to speak. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation. President, first of all, allow me to express our condolences to the representative of Ireland following the loss that they suffered. This is obviously a loss to the Irish mission and for all of us. So please accept our condolences now. President, colleagues, we've already said that during Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, information was discovered regarding the implementation of the Ukrainian authorities with the support and the direct supervision of the US Ministry of Defense of dangerous projects as part of their military and biological program. This activity was carried out on the territory of Ukraine, at the center of Eastern Europe, and in the western borders of Russia, which created a real threat for the biosecurity of our country and the whole region. A week ago, on the request of the Russian Federation, there was the first Security Council meeting held on this topic. Here we asked our Western colleagues a series of questions, but they haven't yet responded to them. The representative of the US wasn't able to explain how the statements of the American officials about how there's allegedly no US-controlled biolaboratories on Ukraine, how that tallies with the fact of the presence of documentary proof of this kind of cooperation between Kiev and Washington. I'd recall here we're talking about an agreement signed in 2005 between the US Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Health of Ukraine, which clearly sets forth support for the Pentagon to joint biological research applicable to dangerous pathogens located in facilities on Ukrainian territory. Although the American delegation can't and does not want to respond to our questions, but they are, as much as the Russian Defense Ministry is aware, is studying what materials we received from Ukraine by laboratories about the implementation of military biological programs of the US and their NATO allies on Ukrainian territory. Over the last week, new details have come to light, which allow us to state that the components for biological weapons were being created on the territory of Ukraine. The implementation of the aforementioned American-Ukrainian agreement from 2005, and comments on which we're still waiting for from the US representation, has been going full steam ahead for all these years. However, from the document we can see that the American colleagues were not helping, as they claim, the Ukrainian Ministry of Health, but rather the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. The Security Council document that we distributed this morning, and you see in that material, you can see the so-called technical assistance plan for certain recipients of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. I recommend you to look at this document very carefully. It confirms direct funding and supervision of the Pentagon and its Defense Threat Reduction Agency of military and biological projects in Ukraine. The overall quantity of the funding was $32 million, and the money went directly to the following laboratories from the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. In Kiev, the 10th Regional Health Epidemiological Department of the Central Health Epidemiological Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. In Odessa, the 27th Regional Health Epidemiological Department of the Central Epidemiological Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. In Lvov, the 28th Regional Health Epidemiological Department of the Central Epidemiological Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. In Kharkov, the 108th Regional Department of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense Epidemiological Department. I'd like to draw your attention to another vitally important point. The representative of the US State Departments continue to muddle the information and ascertain that US allegedly does not operate in any biological laboratories in the territory of Ukraine, but the facts show otherwise. According to the plan that I mentioned for technical assistance, the donor is the US Ministry of Defense. They established the tasks and the workload as part of the projects on Ukrainian territory, and they set forth a list of the necessary equipment and delegated significant authority to an affiliated contractor company, Black & Veatch, with cooperation with Ukrainian bodies of authority. The recipient of American assistance was the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, and they were allowed timely access for Pentagon and contractor staff to laboratories on Ukrainian territory in order to carry out work as part of these projects, and also to provide access to these facilities alongside Pentagon staff, foreign scientists too. The projects themselves included was implemented not by the Ukrainian scientists, but with their participation. Put simply, the Ukrainian authorities gave the Pentagon carte blanche on the territory of Ukraine to carry out dangerous biological experiments there. The American contractors at the same time got a tax break under Ukrainian legislation. So what did the Ukrainian scientists receive in return, i.e. the Ukrainian people? Free travel to international conferences based on expenses for food and accommodation as established for US civil servants. This kind of compensation is carried out, that's the compensation provided for working alongside dangerous biological science. This is not the noble assistance to Ukraine that the American representatives talk about. This is a cynical use of its territory and population for dangerous research, which Washington does not carry out on its own territory, so it doesn't run a risk of hurting its own people. won't be surprised if similar facts about activities supervised by the US appear in laboratories in other regions of the world too. We call on countries who provide their territory for carrying out this kind of experiments to the Pentagon to carefully study the contracts for their cooperation with the US in the biological domain. We fully require the question from China to the US to share the data of the activity of the 360 laboratories under American control around the world. Going back to Ukraine, these biolaboratories in Kiev, Odessa, Lvov and Kharkov were selected by the US Risk Reduction Agency not by chance. They were those who implemented the UP8 project focused on studying pathogens of Congo Crimea fever, leptospirosis and hantaviruses. We believe that the interest of the military biologists of the US is specifically in those pathogens is linked to the fact that they are naturally present both in Ukraine and in Russia, and so that their use could then be dressed up as a natural outbreak of these diseases. On the basis of, in the laboratory in Kharkov, there's also the P781 project to study transmission to humans of diseases through bats. Work on this was done alongside the infamous Lugara Center in Tbilisi. In this context, separate attention should be paid to the Pentagon's choice of carrying out work, the contractors chosen to carry out work in Ukraine, the Black & Veatch company. This is not just any old company. For more than 100 years, it's been working for the American Army. It has built for the Army military bases, including a laboratory in Los Alamos, to develop nuclear weapons. Research into human transmission of diseases through bats in Ukrainian biolaboratories was systemic and has been happening as a minimum since 2009 with the direct oversight of specialists from the USA. During the implementation of these projects, 6 families of viruses were identified, including coronaviruses and 3 types of pathogenic bacteria, the pathogens from the plague, brucellosis, and leptospirosis. These are the most attractive option to use in order for infection because they are resistant to medicine and they spread very quickly from animals to people. As part of the Flu Fly Away project, the Kharkov Institute of Veterinary Medicine studied wild birds as a vector to transmit avian flu. At the same time, they assessed the ways in which the transmission process could become uncontrollable, cause economic damage, and create a risk to food security. Documents show the involvement of the Kharkov Institute in the work to collect strains of avian flu viruses which have high epidemiological potential and could cross the species barrier. The Russian Ministry of Defense also has more and more new documents about the transfer of samples of blood serum from Ukrainian citizens to the territory of third countries, including to the UK, Georgia, and Germany. The analysis of the information gives us grounds to say that the Ukrainian specialists were not informed about the potential risks of transfer of biological materials and are kept in the dark and don't have a real idea about the real objectives of the research being carried out. And this is not surprising if, according to the contract documentation that I mentioned earlier, they are simply playing a secondary role. We also have new data about attempts to destroy biological materials and documentation in Ukrainian laboratories in order to quickly wipe the traces of the implementation of military and biological programs. We know that during the activities to destroy this, the veterinary medicine laboratory in Hlebodarsk town, their citizens of Ukraine, the staff working there, weren't even allowed into the building. This laboratory cooperates with the Melchnikov Scientific Research Institute in Odessa, where research is carried out into pathogens of the plague, anthrax, cholera, and tularemia. In their attempts to wipe the traces of biological waste from the laboratories in Hlebodarsk, these waste was taken 120 kilometers towards the western border, towards Tarutino and Berezino. The Russian Ministry of Defense has recorded all of this information to carry out a legal assessment further down the line. The urgent destruction of documents in the Herson laboratory, we believe the reason for this rush was their wish to hide from Russian specialists information about an outbreak in 2019 in Herson of Dirophilariasis, as a disease which is spread by mosquitoes. The 4 cases of infection of this disease were identified in February, which is not usual for the life cycle of these insects, even to bearing in mind the incubation period for the disease. At the same time, we are aware that in April 2019, a representative of the Pentagon visited the local health institutions where they learnt of the results of the epidemiological research, and they were able to copy the medical documentation. I'm ready to snap up any fakes which are provided by the Ukrainian authorities with the support of their Western backers. The Western media expressing doubts as regards the reliability of the material that the Russian Ministry of Defense has published. I'd like to draw your attention to the following. The documents that we found have a signature, a real signature of officials from the US. Particularly, many of them are signed by the head of the Ukrainian office of the Threat Reduction Agency, Joanna Wintrell. This is a Pentagon staff member and well-known in non-proliferation circles. Before Ukraine, she supervised the destruction of chemical weapons in Libya. If journalists really are interested in verifying the documents that we provided, then I propose that you ask her directly, is that really her signature? I'd like to underscore once again that here we're talking not simply about the US and Ukraine's violation of the Biological Weapons Convention. We're actually talking about that there is more and more proof that at the centre of Eastern Europe, until the very last minute, there was a dangerous military biological activity being carried out, the consequences of which at any time could spread beyond the country and even into the region. The scale of casualties, including amongst the population of European countries in this case, in this scenario, is hard to imagine. Coronavirus could be nothing compared with this. We're also concerned by that there's a threat that already exists. For example, in 2018, those living in Lugansk and Donetsk, there was a sharp spike in cases of tuberculosis caused by a new multi-resistant strain. During this mass outbreak recorded in the region, near Pesk, more than 70 cases of infection were recorded, which quickly became lethal. This doesn't look like coincidence. In conclusion, I'd like to comment on the statement made by the representative of the UN Secretariat, that the Secretariat does not have information about the implementation of military and biological programs on the territory of Ukraine. In line with this BWC, states parties provide the UN information about facilities and biological activities carried out. We're talking about confidence-building measures which are published in order to monitor implementation of the convention. Since 2006, which was when these projects started, including the projects UP4, UP8, and P781, the US and Ukraine has been deliberately keeping quiet about this in their reports, despite the clear military and biological purposes of this. This is why Russia, for many years, has been calling for a strengthening of the BWC regime and to adopt a legally binding protocol to the convention, which should allow us to create an effective mechanism of verification and include in reporting from states parties information on military biological activities carried out abroad. For 20 years, the US has been blocking this kind of work, refusing to provide this kind of information. Indeed, one other question, which the representatives of the US have time and time again been not providing us with, all of the facts I listed today on the 11th of March are only the tip of the iceberg. Our Ministry of Defense is receiving more and more material and we're analysing them. We will continue to keep the international community informed about the unlawful activity carried out by the Pentagon on Ukrainian territory. Thank you for your attention.
أشكر ممثل الاتحاد الروسي على بيانه.
I thank the representative of Russia for his statement and give the floor to Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me express our shock on the sudden passing away of a colleague of ours, Ambassador Jim Kelly, DPR of Ireland, and a seasoned diplomat. We convey to our Irish colleagues and to Jim's family our most heartfelt condolences on this terrible loss. Mr. President, we thank USG Nakamitsu for providing us the same information as last Friday on this matter. We heard nothing new from the UN Department of Disarmament Affairs of the United Nations because there is nothing new. We take issues of weapons of mass destruction very, very seriously. But still, there needs to be an issue. Mr. President, we heard last Friday, and it was repeated here, the United Nations is not aware of any alleged program in Ukraine inconsistent with international treaty obligations, including on chemical or biological weapons. So what are we doing this morning? What are we talking about here? For non-existent chemical weapons programs in Ukraine, developed in non-existent laboratories and financed by non-existent programs? Russian claims, and we listened to the statement, remain unverified, unsubstantiated, uncorroborated, and not independently verified. In a word, not credible. It is hard not to think then and believe that today's meeting comes as a last-minute replacement out of an easy pickup drawer, is therefore a loss of time and abuse of the Council. We are afraid to find ourselves in the best-case scenario with an attempt by Russia to try to shift attention from its crimes and the stalling invasion by sowing fear with the dreadful prospects of chemical warfare. Or, at the worst, given Russia's track record of accusing others of the very crimes that they have been perpetrating, including in attempted assassinations and poisoning of its own citizens, Russia intends to use disinformation tactics as a pretext for further escalation and possible use of chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine. We have seen more than once that the more the invasion stalls, the deadlier the missile attacks and bombardments become. This is the real issue and the serious one. Let's remind ourselves, colleagues, that Russia has been saying one thing and doing its opposite, that Russia is blatantly breaking international law, and whenever they speak about Ukraine, they are just distorting reality. Claims need to be properly and fully investigated, and we know how this is and can be done. Russia should first agree to an immediate ceasefire throughout the territory of Ukraine. It should withdraw all military forces within a radius of 40 kilometers of suspected locations, ask that the UN security forces secure 40 kilometers of radius to allow diagnostic research teams to conduct proper investigations. Instead, we have the impression that Russia speaks to itself. Dear colleagues, with the sole exception of Russia, everyone around this table, everyone without exception, as well as 140 members of the UNGA, have been clear on the absolute necessity to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine, to stop the war, to protect civilians, and to deal with issues and concerns not by bombarding indiscriminately, not by killing innocent people, not by destroying a country, not by wreaking economic havoc to the entire world, but through negotiations and through diplomatic channels and mechanisms. This is what needs to be done. This is what Russia should be doing, not abusing the councils with pop-up subjects of convenience, trying to create the illusion of truth out of repeated lies. In Beaumarchais' words, calomnie.
Slander, slander, something will always stick.
The world looks to the Security Council, and for good reason, for hope and solutions as the body responsible for peace and security. It should not be abused for propaganda and irrationality. And I thank you.
أشكر ممثل ألبانيا.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement and give the floor to the representative of the USA.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, High Representative Nakamitsu, for joining us today to repeat what you gave us, exactly what you gave us last week. And last week, we heard from the Russian representative a tirade of bizarre conspiracy theories. This week, we're hearing a whole lot more where that came from, things that sound like they were forwarded to him on a chain email from some dark corner of the internet. President Biden has a word for this kind of talk: malarkey. As I said 1 week ago, Ukraine does not have a biological weapons program. There are no Ukrainian biological weapons laboratories, not near Russia's border, not anywhere. They're only public health facilities, proudly, and I say proudly, supported and recognized by the US government, the World Health Organization, and other governments and international institutions. In fact, it is Russia that has long maintained a biological weapons program in violation of international law. It is Russia that has a well-documented history of using chemical weapons. It is Russia who is the aggressor here. It was Russian operatives who poisoned Alexei Navalny and Sergei and Yulia Skripal with nerve agents. It is Russia that continues to support the Assad regime in Syria and shield it from accountability when the UN and the OPCW have confirmed that Assad has recently used chemical weapons over the past several years. Let's not forget why we are really here today. We're here because Russia knew its cynical ploy to pass an exculpatory resolution had failed. This meeting is the result of their isolation on this council and on the world stage. We're not buying what they're selling, literally or figuratively. And I will reiterate the United States' deep and serious concern that Russia's calling for this meeting is a potential false flag effort in action. Russia has repeatedly accused other countries of the very violations it plans to perpetrate. We continue to believe it is possible that Russia may be planning to use chemical or biological agents against the Ukrainian people. We aren't going to dignify Russia's disinformation or conspiracy theories, but we will continue to sound the alarm and tell the world where we think Russia is heading. And we will remind the world that Russia has repeatedly lied to this council over recent weeks. Despite all the evidence we could see with our own eyes, it told us that it was not going to invade Ukraine, that it was engaged in war games, that it was interested in diplomacy. I asked the Russian PR, where are the 100,000 troops who were sitting on the Russian side of the border now? Sadly, I think many of them have given their lives in this senseless, unconscionable war against the Ukrainian people. Russia lied to its own people as well, shutting down media to try and hide the truth. And I will not repeat the slurs and false accusations that Russia has hurled against the Ukrainian people and the United States repeatedly at this table. But we know that Russia's disinformation is a sign of its desperation. That's the truth, and we will continue to ensure the world sees it and hears it. Thank you, Mr. President.
أشكر
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement and give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to say at the beginning, Mr. President, how much the Irish delegation appreciates the messages of condolences we've received on the sudden loss of an outstanding Irish diplomat, colleague and friend. Yesh Day Gorava Anam, may he rest in peace. Mr. President, I would like to thank High Representative Nakamitsu for her briefing. Ireland deeply regrets the decision of the Russian Federation to call for today's meeting. It has done so yet again for no other reason than to promote its spurious claims against Ukraine and others. It is deeply troubling to hear the Russian Federation spreading unsubstantiated, unfounded allegations. The only so-called proof provided is to point to transparent projects necessary for biosecurity, for human or animal health. Research of the kind carried out by many countries to advance global health, benefiting mankind. President, I urge the Russian Federation to cease its campaigns of disinformation and attempts to distract from what is really happening because of its war in Ukraine. This behavior is disturbingly consistent with the Russian Federation's own track record of using disinformation in multiple multilateral fora to dissemble and deny its activities. Russian military forces in Ukraine have already demonstrated reckless disregard for nuclear safety and security since the start of their invasion. This pattern of recklessness raises real fears of a significant radiological, chemical, or biological accident. It is unacceptable to make unfounded accusations against Ukraine, a state party in good standing to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and the Biological Weapons Convention. President, the use of chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine would inflict untold additional suffering on the Ukrainian people, who have already suffered so much from the actions of the Russian Federation. Use of these heinous weapons is immoral and illegal in any circumstance. There will be no impunity for those who use them. We urge the Russian Federation not to violate or undermine the essential multilateral disarmament and non-proliferation instruments upon which our collective security depends. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank